Why America is great. The Environmental Protection Agency. When we think about what makes America great, we often focus on freedom, innovation, or economic prosperity. But one of the most significant yet underappreciated achievements of American governance is the creation and evolution of the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA represents a uniquely American story of recognizing a crisis, mobilizing democratic institutions to address it, and fundamentally transforming how a nation relates to its natural environment. Before 1970, the United States faced an environmental catastrophe. Rivers caught fire, smog choked cities, toxic waste poisoned communities, and industrial pollution went largely unchecked. The creation of the EPA marked a turning point, not just for America, but for environmental policy worldwide. This agency embodies several quintessentially American values: the willingness to confront difficult problems, the power of democratic action, the application of scientific expertise to public policy, and the constant tension and dialogue between economic development and environmental stewardship. The crisis that demanded action. To understand why the EPA matters, we need to understand the environmental conditions that existed before its creation. In the 1960s, American industrial might was at its peak. But this prosperity came at an extraordinary environmental cost. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland had caught fire multiple times due to oil slicks and industrial waste floating on its surface. The most infamous fire in 1969 became a national symbol of environmental degradation. Lake Erie was declared dead from pollution. Los Angeles experienced smog so thick that residents couldn't see across the street on bad days. Air pollution was causing tens of thousands of premature deaths annually. Lead from gasoline filled the air in every major city, damaging the cognitive development of millions of children. DDT and other pesticides were accumulating in the food chain, devastating bird populations and entering human bodies. Industrial facilities dumped mercury, PCBs, and countless other toxins directly into waterways with no consequences. Entire communities lived next to unregulated hazardous waste sites. This environmental crisis was fundamentally a market failure and a failure of existing governance structures. Before the EPA, environmental regulation was fragmented across different agencies with conflicting mandates. The Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and various other agencies had overlapping and often contradictory responsibilities. There was no unified approach, no consistent standards, and no real enforcement mechanism. The democratic response. What makes America great is visible in how the nation responded to this crisis. The environmental movement of the 1960s was a grassroots phenomenon that forced political action. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, awakened public consciousness to the dangers of unregulated pesticide use. The first Earth Day on April 22, 1970, saw 20 million Americans, roughly 10% of the population, participate in demonstrations and educational events. This remains one of the largest single-day civic mobilizations in American history. This public pressure translated into political action across party lines. President Richard Nixon, responding to overwhelming public demand, proposed the creation of the EPA in July 1970. Congress, with strong bipartisan support, had already passed the National Environmental Policy Act in January 1970, requiring environmental impact assessments for major federal actions. The Clean Air Act of 1970 passed the Senate without a single dissenting vote. The Clean Water Act of 1972 passed both houses with veto-proof majorities. This bipartisan consensus on environmental protection reflected a broader American pragmatism. Conservatives and liberals, rural and urban representatives all recognized that pollution didn't respect political boundaries or ideological preferences. The air everyone breathed and the water everyone drank required collective action. The EPA officially began operations on December 2, 1970, consolidating environmental responsibilities from 5 different executive departments and several independent agencies. It brought together approximately 5,800 employees and a budget measured in 1970 dollars. This administrative reorganization represented a fundamental reimagining of how government could address complex, interconnected problems. The EPA's core mission and structure. The EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment. This deceptively simple mandate encompasses extraordinarily complex responsibilities. The agency regulates air and water quality, manages hazardous waste, oversees pesticide use, monitors radiation exposure, and enforces environmental laws across every sector of the economy. The agency's structure reflects American federalism. The EPA sets national standards but works extensively with state and local governments on implementation and enforcement. This cooperative federalism allows states to adopt stricter standards than federal minimums and to tailor programs to local conditions while maintaining baseline protections nationwide. The EPA operates through 10 regional offices, each handling a different geographic area. This regional structure ensures that agency personnel understand local environmental conditions, economic realities, and community concerns. A pollution challenge in the Pacific Northwest differs fundamentally from one in the Gulf Coast, and the regional structure allows for appropriate responses. As of 2024, the EPA had over 16,000 onboard employees from various funding authorities, including base appropriations, fee programs, and funding from the infrastructure and climate laws. The agency's fiscal year 2024 operating plan shows hiring goals above 15,000 employees for base appropriations. The budget varies significantly by administration and congressional action, with ongoing debates about appropriate funding levels. Major environmental achievements. The EPA's accomplishments over 5 decades demonstrate what effective government regulation can achieve. The improvements in American environmental quality since 1970 are among the most significant public health successes in modern history. Air quality improvements are particularly dramatic. Between 1970 and 2023, aggregate emissions of the 6 principal air pollutants dropped by 78%, even as the US population increased by 63%. Vehicle miles traveled increased by 194%, and gross domestic product grew by over 320%. This decoupling of economic growth from environmental degradation is a remarkable achievement. Lead emissions decreased by more than 98% after the EPA phased out leaded gasoline and lead paint between 1980 and 2005. The average blood lead level in American children dropped dramatically over this period. This single regulatory action prevented millions of cases of cognitive impairment and saved countless lives. Economic analyses estimate that removing lead from gasoline provides benefits exceeding costs by a substantial margin. The phase-out of chlorofluorocarbons, which were destroying the ozone layer, represents successful international environmental cooperation led by American action. The EPA's implementation of the Montreal Protocol has prevented millions of cases of skin cancer and cataracts. Water quality improvements are equally impressive. Before the Clean Water Act, only about a third of American waterways were safe for fishing and swimming. Today, that figure exceeds 2/3. The Cuyahoga River, once so polluted it caught fire, now hosts fish populations and recreational activities. Lake Erie, declared dead in the 1960s, has recovered substantially, though challenges remain. The EPA's Superfund program, created in 1980, has cleaned up hundreds of the nation's most contaminated, hazardous waste sites. While progress has been slower than initially hoped, the program has addressed sites that posed immediate dangers to nearby communities. Many sites have been successfully cleaned up and removed from the national priorities list. Pesticide regulation has prevented countless cases of poisoning and ecosystem damage. DDT, banned by the EPA in 1972, has largely cleared from American ecosystems, allowing bald eagle populations to recover dramatically. The bald eagle population, which hit an all-time low of 417 known nesting pairs in 1963, has rebounded to approximately 316,700 individual eagles in the lower 48 states as of the 2020 population estimate, including over 71,000 nesting pairs. This represents a conservation success story directly attributable to regulatory action. Economic impact and innovation. Critics sometimes portray environmental regulation as economically burdensome. But the EPA's track record demonstrates that environmental protection and economic prosperity are compatible and often mutually reinforcing. The agency's analyses, peer-reviewed and published, consistently show that the benefits of major EPA regulations far exceed their costs. A comprehensive EPA analysis of Clean Air Act benefits from 1990 to 2020 estimated that the law prevented 230,000 premature deaths in 2020 alone, along with hundreds of thousands of cases of respiratory illness, heart attacks, and lost workdays. The economic value of these benefits was estimated at $2 trillion annually, while compliance costs were approximately $65 billion annually, a benefit-to-cost ratio of more than 30 to 1. Environmental regulations have spurred innovation across American industries. Catalytic converters, required by EPA air quality standards, became a major product for American manufacturers. Energy efficiency improvements driven by EPA standards have saved consumers and businesses substantial amounts on energy costs. The renewable energy sector employs hundreds of thousands of Americans and grew partly in response to environmental regulations and incentives. The environmental services industry, which includes pollution control, waste management, environmental consulting, and cleanup services, employs well over 1 million Americans and generates substantial economic activity annually. This industry exists largely because of EPA regulations creating demand for environmental compliance and remediation services. Moreover, environmental quality itself has economic value. Clean air and water attract businesses and skilled workers. Recreational opportunities on restored waterways and in protected areas support tourism economies. Property values are higher in areas with good environmental quality. The economic benefits of environmental amenities are increasingly recognized in regional development strategies. Challenges and controversies. The EPA's history has not been without controversy, and understanding these conflicts helps illuminate broader American debates about the proper role of government, the balance between economic development and environmental protection, and the distribution of regulatory costs and benefits. Industry resistance to regulation has been constant. Major EPA rules typically face legal challenges from regulated entities. The cost of compliance is real, particularly for smaller businesses and economically marginal facilities. The EPA has struggled to balance stringent environmental protection with economic impacts on affected communities. The agency has also faced criticism from environmental advocates who argue it moves too slowly, fails to address emerging contaminants, and succumbs to political pressure to weaken standards. The PFAS contamination crisis, involving so-called forever chemicals that have spread throughout American water systems, exemplifies the challenge of addressing emerging threats with existing regulatory frameworks. Political changes affect EPA operations significantly. Different administrations have expanded or contracted the agency's budget, altered enforcement priorities, and changed regulatory approaches. During some periods, the EPA has aggressively pursued enforcement actions and expanded regulatory authority. During others, the agency has focused on voluntary partnerships with industry and reduced enforcement activity. The Trump administration, from 2017 to 2021, rolled back or weakened numerous environmental regulations, arguing that previous rules were economically burdensome and exceeded EPA authority. The Biden administration, beginning in 2021, sought to restore many of these protections and expand EPA authority over emerging issues like climate change and PFAS contamination. This political volatility creates regulatory uncertainty that affects long-term business planning and environmental outcomes. Industry representatives often argue for more stable, predictable regulations, even if somewhat stricter, rather than rules that change dramatically with each administration. Federal-state tensions persist. Some states want stricter environmental standards than federal minimums and resist EPA attempts to limit state authority. Other states argue that EPA regulations impose unrealistic burdens and interfere with state sovereignty. California's long-running disputes with EPA over vehicle emissions standards exemplify these tensions. Environmental justice issues have gained prominence. Low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately bear environmental burdens, located near polluting facilities, waste sites, and major roadways. The EPA has increasingly focused on environmental justice, creating offices and programs dedicated to addressing disparate impacts, but progress remains incomplete. Climate change and the EPA's evolving role. Climate change represents perhaps the most significant challenge the EPA has faced, testing the limits of the agency's authority and capacity under laws written before climate science fully emerged. The EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases was unclear until the Supreme Court's 2007 decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, which held that greenhouse gases qualify as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and that the EPA has authority to regulate them if they endanger public health and welfare. This decision opened the door to EPA climate action, but also created ongoing legal and political battles over the scope and limits of that authority. The Obama administration used EPA authority to implement the Clean Power Plan, which would have required states to reduce carbon emissions from power plants. However, the Supreme Court stayed this regulation in 2016, and it never took effect. The Trump administration repealed it and replaced it with the much weaker Affordable Clean Energy Rule. The Biden administration has pursued more aggressive climate action through EPA authority. The EPA has worked to finalize regulations limiting greenhouse gas emissions from power plants and establishing emission standards for vehicles that will effectively require a substantial shift toward electric vehicles over the coming decades. These regulations face legal challenges, arguing that EPA is exceeding its statutory authority under the Major Questions Doctrine, a legal principle that requires explicit congressional authorization for agency actions of vast economic and political significance. The Supreme Court's 2022 decision in West Virginia versus EPA, which struck down certain approaches to power plant regulation, signals potential limits on EPA's climate authority. This ongoing legal and political battle over climate regulation reflects deeper American debates about administrative power, the separation of powers, and how to address problems that require sustained, long-term policy commitments that may transcend electoral cycles. Scientific expertise and evidence-based policy. One of the EPA's greatest strengths has been its commitment to scientific expertise and evidence-based policymaking. The agency employs thousands of scientists and engineers who conduct research, monitor environmental conditions, and analyze the effects of pollutants and regulations. The EPA's scientific assessment process involves extensive peer review, public comment, and evaluation by independent advisory committees. The Science Advisory Board, established in 1978, provides independent scientific and technical advice to the administrator. The Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee and other specialized panels review the scientific basis for regulatory decisions. This commitment to science has generally served the agency well, providing legitimacy and credibility for controversial regulations. When the EPA sets an air quality standard or establishes a maximum contaminant level for drinking water, these decisions rest on extensive scientific analysis of health effects, exposure pathways, and risk assessment. However, the relationship between science and policy is complex. Scientific evidence can establish that a substance poses health risks, but deciding what level of risk is acceptable involves value judgments that science alone cannot answer. How do we weigh competing risks? How much should we discount future benefits? How do we value non-market goods like ecosystem health or aesthetic enjoyment of nature? The EPA must also make decisions under uncertainty. Scientific understanding is incomplete, and waiting for perfect information could mean allowing ongoing harm. The precautionary principle, the idea that we should err on the side of protecting health and environment when scientific uncertainty exists, conflicts with concerns about imposing costs based on incomplete evidence. Different administrations have sought to change how the EPA uses scientific evidence. Some have pushed for more transparent science, requiring public availability of underlying data. Others have argued these requirements could exclude important studies, particularly epidemiological research involving confidential health information. The EPA as a model for the world. American environmental regulation, pioneered by the EPA, has influenced environmental policy worldwide. Many countries have created environmental protection agencies modeled on the EPA. International environmental agreements often incorporate regulatory approaches first developed in the United States. The concept of technology-based standards, requiring the use of best available technology to control pollution, originated with American environmental law and has been adopted globally. Environmental impact assessment, required by the National Environmental Policy Act, has become standard practice in countries worldwide. The trading of pollution allowances, used in the EPA's acid rain program, became a model for carbon trading systems in Europe and elsewhere. American environmental scientists and regulators have provided technical assistance to other countries developing environmental regulations. EPA methodologies for risk assessment, emissions monitoring, and environmental analysis have become international standards. However, American environmental leadership has waned in some respects. The United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol and temporarily withdrew from the Paris Agreement during the Trump administration. Before rejoining under Biden, many European countries and some developing nations now have more ambitious climate policies than the United States. American reluctance to embrace strong climate action has undermined global efforts and damaged American credibility on environmental issues. Looking forward, the EPA faces significant challenges in the coming years. Climate change requires sustained, comprehensive action that tests the limits of existing statutory authority and regulatory capacity. Emerging contaminants like PFAS, microplastics, and new industrial chemicals require regulatory frameworks that can adapt more quickly to scientific discoveries. Environmental justice demands more attention to distributional impacts of both pollution and regulation. How do we ensure that environmental improvements benefit everyone, not just affluent communities? How do we address the legacy of environmental racism that concentrated pollution burdens on minority communities? The intersection of environmental protection with other policy priorities grows more complex. Water scarcity in the West requires balancing environmental flows to maintain ecosystems with agricultural and urban water demands. Renewable energy development creates environmental impacts even as it addresses climate change. Electric vehicle batteries require materials mined in environmentally damaging ways. Polarization threatens the bipartisan consensus that once supported environmental protection. Environmental policy has become increasingly partisan, with environmental protection viewed by some as a liberal priority rather than a shared American value. Rebuilding broader political support for environmental protection is essential for long-term success. Despite these challenges, the EPA's track record provides reason for optimism. The agency has demonstrated capacity for innovation, adaptation, and effective problem-solving over 5 decades. Air and water quality improvements show that environmental regulations can achieve substantial public health benefits while allowing continued economic growth. Conclusion: the Environmental Protection Agency represents what makes America great, not through military might or economic dominance, but through the harder, less glamorous work of democratic governance, addressing complex societal problems. The EPA embodies American pragmatism, the application of scientific expertise to public challenges, the capacity for self-correction when confronted with failures, and the democratic responsiveness to public demands for action. The crisis that prompted EPA's creation was real and urgent. Rivers on fire, smog-choked cities, and poisoned communities demanded response. Americans across the political spectrum recognized that pollution affected everyone and required collective action. The EPA's creation showed that American democracy could mobilize to address existential challenges. The agency's achievements over 5 decades demonstrate effective governance. Dramatic improvements in air and water quality, the prevention of millions of premature deaths, the recovery of ecosystems, and the successful management of hazardous substances show that well-designed, scientifically grounded regulation can work. These successes came through persistent effort, adapting to new challenges, learning from failures, and maintaining commitment to the core mission of protecting health and environment. The EPA also demonstrates American federalism, working as intended. National standards protect all Americans while allowing state innovation and adaptation to local conditions. The tension between federal authority and state autonomy, rather than being purely obstructive, has often produced more effective policy. Importantly, the EPA shows that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not opposing forces. The cleaner environment we enjoy today coexists with an economy many times larger than in 1970. Innovation spurred by environmental regulation has created new industries and improved competitiveness. Environmental quality itself has economic value that contributes to prosperity. The challenges ahead are substantial, particularly regarding climate change, but they are not insurmountable. The EPA's history shows that Americans can address even severe environmental problems when we commit to sustained effort based on scientific understanding and democratic legitimacy. What makes America great is not that we are perfect or that we always get things right the first time. What makes America great is our capacity to recognize problems, mobilize democratic institutions to address them, apply scientific expertise and technological innovation to finding solutions, and persist despite setbacks and opposition. The Environmental Protection Agency, with all its imperfections and controversies, exemplifies these quintessentially American strengths. The agency represents our commitment to leaving the country better than we found it, to protecting the health of our fellow citizens, and to preserving the natural environment that sustains us all. The EPA's story is fundamentally hopeful. It shows that positive change is possible, that determined action can overcome even severe problems, and that American institutions, properly directed by democratic will and scientific understanding, can achieve remarkable things. In an era often characterized by cynicism about government effectiveness, the EPA's track record of environmental improvement stands as powerful evidence that government can work, that regulations can benefit society, and that collective action can solve problems that individuals and markets cannot address alone. This is why the Environmental Protection Agency represents what makes America great, not through easy victories or painless solutions, but through the hard work of democratic governance, scientific inquiry, pragmatic problem-solving, and unwavering commitment to protecting the health and well-being of all Americans and the natural environment we all share.